The little girl's small hands trembled as she tugged at her sleeve, lifting it just enough to reveal the dark, angry bruises that mottled her pale skin. Each mark told a story of fear and silent suffering, of nights spent hiding under blankets while shadows moved too close. Whispering threats she wasn't allowed to speak aloud. Her lips quivered, and her voice was almost swallowed by the noise of the city street. But she whispered anyway. "Mom says we have to stay quiet." Across the sidewalk, a man stood motionless, broad-shouldered and alert, his presence quiet but undeniably commanding. Marcus Kane had once been a Navy SEAL, and though the desert winds and jungle heat of faraway wars were behind him, the instincts of a protector never left. Every subtle shift in the girl's posture, every flicker of her eyes scanning for danger, resonated deeply within him. He knew this look, the tension coiled inside someone forced to endure pain without voice. Pedestrians passed by, some glancing curiously, most walking past as if the scene wasn't there. Their indifference weighed heavier than the asphalt beneath their feet. Marcus noticed it all, the mother's nervous glance, the girl's hesitant steps, the air thick with unspoken fear. In that moment the city street became a battlefield, not of bullets and explosions, but of silence, morality, and courage. He took a careful step forward, mindful not to startle her. His presence was calm, measured, reassuring. No sudden movements, no words that could alarm her. Only the quiet power of someone who would not ignore what was happening. The girl's eyes flicked toward him. Suspicion and hope mingled in the fragile gaze of a child who had been told too many times that speaking up could bring more pain. Marcus's heart tightened at the sight. Every instinct screamed at him to act, but he knew that rushing could be dangerous. He needed patience, observation, and strategy, skills honed over years where lives had been saved or lost in the split second between hesitation and action. From the corner of his eye, Marcus noted the mother's hurried movements, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way she whispered to her daughter to hurry, to keep quiet. Fear hung thick in the air, almost tangible, and Marcus could feel the unspoken rules that bound them. Yet, in that heavy silence, his own code of duty ignited. There would be no turning away, no shrugging off this child's suffering like the passing pedestrians. He would be their unseen shield until help arrived, their silent advocate in a world that often pretends not to notice. The girl's arm shook as she lifted her sleeve higher, and Marcus's gaze softened, filled with a mix of sorrow and resolve. He did not speak. Silence was his ally, in that quiet, invisible bond between protector and vulnerable. A silent understanding past he would see her. He would witness her pain. And he would act when the moment was right. Marcus Kane's mind drifted briefly as he observed the girl, her trembling hand, the bruises that no child should ever bear. Memories he had tried to bury surfaced with the clarity of a battlefield sunrise. He had been deployed to some of the deadliest regions on the planet, places where survival meant moving silently, anticipating danger in every shadow, every whisper of wind. Afghanistan, Iraq, remote jungle outposts where danger was never announced and loss was always sudden. He had seen friends fall beside him, men whose laughter and courage had been abruptly silenced. The memory of Corporal Davis came unbidden, his laughter too loud, his love too open. His life ended by an unseen bullet. Marcus remembered the coppery smell of blood mixed with dust, the taste of smoke on his tongue, the grit of sand between his teeth. Those experiences had forged him, tempered him in ways civilians could never understand. Every sense honed to a razor's edge, the subtle quiver of a muscle signaling intent, the almost imperceptible narrowing of an eye that betrayed danger, the faint tremor in the air when fear passed through a human body. Yet the wars he had fought abroad were not the only battles that shaped him. Returning home had been a different kind of challenge. A world that valued the visible but ignored the silent suffering tested him in ways combat never could. Domestic abuse cases, children hiding scars behind long sleeves, cries too quiet to be heard in crowded rooms, he recognized them instantly. Even in the suburban neighborhoods where he walked in plain clothes, he saw injustice hidden behind closed doors, in hushed whispers, in trembling voices. Marcus understood that courage was not only displayed on the battlefield, but in the quiet vigilance of everyday life. He remembered his own family, waiting for him in the dimly lit house he had returned to. They had noticed the change almost immediately, the long silences that stretched through the dinner table, the restless nights where sleep came only in fragments, the faraway gaze that often lingered too long. He had tried to explain, in words that never seemed adequate, that the world he had returned to was just as dangerous as any war zone, though the threats were subtler, the weapons invisible. Now, as he crouched to be at the little girl's level, Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over him. This was another kind of battlefield, another mission that required precision, patience, and courage, not the courage of guns and grenades, but the courage of observation, empathy, and action. Every bruise on her arm, every quiver in her voice, told him exactly what he needed to know. He inhaled slowly, noticing the scent of the street, the faint residue of chalk and asphalt, the distant aroma of coffee from a nearby cafe, the metallic tang of fear hanging invisibly in the air. He felt the tension in his own muscles, the quiet rhythm of his heartbeat sensing with the girl's, as if his body instinctively sought to protect hers. In that brief, suspended moment, Marcus's training and his life experience converged. He had been a soldier, yes, but he was also a witness to suffering, a guardian in a world that often preferred to look away. He knew that action needed careful timing, that panic could be as dangerous as indifference. Yet he also knew that there were moments when silence alone was insufficient, and when the balance between patience and intervention had to be measured with both heart and discipline. He glanced again at the little girl, her wide eyes filled with fear, yet holding a fragile spark of hope. Marcus realized that hope, however faint, was fragile and precious. It had to be nurtured, protected, and never ignored. And in that quiet resolve, he made a silent vow: no matter the obstacles, no matter the fear, he would ensure that she would be safe. The mother's steps were hurried, almost frantic, each one betraying a silent fear that clung to her like a second skin. She leaned slightly toward the little girl, her hands brushing nervously against her daughter's, as if to shield her from a world she believed would punish curiosity and courage alike. We can't tell anyone," she murmured, her voice low and trembling, her gaze darting to the edges of the street where strangers passed indifferently, unseeing, uncaring. Marcus remained a shadow beside them, silent but watchful, a calm presence in a sea of hesitation. He did not speak, did not approach too closely. Yet his eyes were unwavering, scanning every movement, every twitch, every fleeting expression. He had learned long ago that in situations like this, a wrong word, a sudden gesture could escalate fear into danger. Patience was his weapon, vigilance his shield. Every passerby was a story in themselves, yet none intervened. A businessman brushed past without a glance, earbuds plugged in, lost in his own world. A teenager on a bicycle slowed for a moment, curiosity tugging at his gaze, but then pedaled on, distracted. A group of mothers watched their children play nearby, but avoided meeting the girl's eyes. The silence of the crowd was deafening, a societal acquiescence that weighed on Marcus like lead. The little girl's arm trembled again, the bruises standing out in stark contrast to the pale skin that surrounded them. She looked up at Marcus, fleetingly, as if searching for permission, reassurance, or perhaps just acknowledgement that someone saw her pain and believed it mattered. Marcus met her gaze without hesitation. His silence was deliberate. He did not need to speak, his presence alone told her, "You are seen. You are not alone." The mother's nervous whispers continued, fragmented and hurried. "Hurry, we can't, don't they'll." Her sentences faltered, each one revealing the fear and trauma she herself had internalized. Marcus recognized the pattern lay, a parent trapped between protecting a child and obeying an abuser. It was a quiet, dangerous battlefield, one in which fear was weaponized to demand silence. They turned a corner into a less crowded street. Marcus noted the subtle tension in the mother's shoulders, the way she glanced over her shoulder, as though the shadows themselves carried threats. Every detail mattered. The texture of her fear, the pace of her steps, the hesitant tug at her daughter's hand, it all spoke volumes. And Marcus listened, absorbed, cataloged. He reached subtly into his backpack, feeling the familiar edges of a notepad and pen. No dramatic gesture, no abrupt motion. He began to record details, times, locations, observations, every bruise, every fearful glance. It was methodical, invisible, precise. His notebook became a silent weapon, one that would protect this child not with force, but with the irrefutable weight of evidence. As they walked, Marcus noticed a fleeting movement in a nearby alleyway. A woman paused, watching them. Something in her stance, a subtle straightening of her shoulders, the faint recognition in her eyes, hinted that she was no ordinary passerby. Marcus's instincts told him she might be the ally they had been waiting for, someone who would act decisively once the moment arrived. The tension mounted like a taut wire ready to snap. The mother whispered again, more urgently, "We can't, they'll." The girl clutched her mother's hand, squeezing tightly, as though anchoring herself to the only familiar presence left in her life. Marcus could see the fear reflected in the child's wide, innocent eyes, the weight of rules imposed by someone meant to protect, but who instead demanded silence. Marcus's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He could feel the invisible balance tipping. The world around them was indifferent, the mother's fear immobilizing, and yet the child's courage, the act of showing her bruises, of risking retribution, created a moment of truth. The scales of power were about to shift, quietly but inevitably, in the direction of justice. Silence became the conduit for action. In his careful observation, Marcus understood that confrontation, when timed precisely, could become unstoppable. The streets were quiet witnesses. The mother's fear was palpable, and the child's unspoken plea echoed louder than any cry, "See me. Protect me, help me." As Marcus guided the mother and child through the quieter streets, his gaze remained vigilant, noting every detail, every subtle shift in posture, every tremor of fear. Then, a flicker of recognition caught his eye, a woman standing near a small park entrance, arms folded, her posture deliberate and poised. She watched them for a heartbeat, then stepped forward, calm but purposeful. Marcus instinctively recognized her, not just as a passerby, but as someone with knowledge, authority, and the capacity to act decisively. The woman's eyes met Marcus's with a silent understanding, a nod exchanged between two people who had spent years recognizing signals of distress without words. This was their ally, a Child Protective Services officer. Someone trained to navigate danger quietly but effectively, someone who could translate silent observation into immediate, actionable intervention. Marcus didn't speak. He merely allowed the mother and child to drift closer, his presence steady, unwavering. Every movement was deliberate, every glance calculated. The mother's tension didn't lessen immediately. She flinched as the officer stepped into their path, as though she expected punishment for the child's exposure, for the truth that now could no longer hide. The officer approached the mother gently, her voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of authority tempered by compassion. Marcus observed silently, noting the mother's hesitation, the subtle quivering in her hands, the flicker of guilt in her eyes. The child, sensing the shift in energy, relaxed just enough to allow a faint smile to break through her fear. For the first time in what felt like months, she felt seen, validated, and safe. Marcus reached into his backpack and produced the notebook he had been meticulously filling. Every detail, each bruise, every whispered admission, every fearful glance, was recorded with precision. The officer scanned the notebook, nodding subtly. Marcus knew that the combination of documentation, observation, and timely intervention would form an unassailable shield for the child. The mother's protests were quiet but desperate. We can't, they'll," she stammered, her voice trembling. Marcus's gaze met hers, steady and unyielding. No words were necessary, his silence conveyed resolve, authority, and moral certainty. He was a witness. He was a protector, and the truth they could not escape was now visible, undeniable. Within hours, intervention unfolded like a carefully choreographed sequence. Law enforcement arrived to corroborate the observations. Social workers prepared the child for safe relocation, and medical personnel documented the injuries with clinical precision. Marcus observed from a distance, his presence unnoticed but essential, a silent guardian ensuring that every step upheld the child's safety without causing unnecessary panic or confrontation. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Where fear had ruled, competence and vigilance now prevailed. Where silence had demanded obedience, documentation and moral authority demanded justice. The mother's resistance softened under the unassailable weight of truth. The quiet authority of trained professionals and the unshakable presence of Marcus, who had ensured that no detail went unnoticed. In the midst of this transformation, Marcus realized that true strength often goes unseen. Battles are not always fought with weapons or explosive force. Sometimes, they are won with observation, patience, and unwavering resolve. The child's fear was slowly replaced by tentative trust. Her small hand, once trembling and uncertain, now clung to the officers as if anchoring herself to safety. Marcus allowed himself a moment to exhale. knowing that the invisible war he had waged, between indifference and action, silence and protection, was tipping in favor of justice. Even in the quietest moments, Marcus's instincts remained sharp. He watched, he noted, he protected. He understood that the world often ignores pain unless it is impossible to deny. By documenting, by observing, by acting silently yet decisively, he had transformed helplessness into safety, fear into protection, and isolation into a network of unseen support. Days passed, but the weight of the invisible battle lingered. The little girl, once trembling with fear, now moved through the world with cautious confidence. Every step she took, every glance she offered, carried the quiet strength of someone who had survived silence and seen courage act on her behalf. Marcus observed from a distance as she entered a small, sunlit school auditorium for the first time since the incident. Her small hand clutched tightly to the officer's, her eyes scanning the room full of strangers with tentative curiosity. The bruises on her arm were fading, but the memory of being overlooked, of being told to stay quiet, was etched into her awareness. And yet now, that fear had begun to transform into hope. The auditorium was alive with parents and children, laughter mingling with the soft rustle of programs, and the faint scent of chalk and polished wood. Marcus watched silently as a few parents noticed the girl and offered gentle smiles, subtle gestures of support. She returned them with a shy, flickering smile that held the fragile promise of trust renewed. In this moment, Marcus felt the culmination of every quiet act of observation, every meticulous note, every patient step of intervention he had taken. The mother, now cooperating fully with the authorities and seeking guidance for herself, watched from the back of the auditorium. Her eyes, once clouded with fear and defensiveness, now shone with tentative relief. She knew that while the scars could not vanish overnight, the child's safety and dignity had been restored. Marcus's presence, though invisible to most, had been the anchor ensuring that this fragile equilibrium held. In that small auditorium, the world seemed to pause. The child's courage, combined with the silent intervention of those who cared enough to act without fanfare, had reshaped reality. Fear had been replaced by protection, isolation by solidarity. Marcus allowed himself a rare, quiet smile, a recognition that justice had arrived not through shouting or spectacle, but through calm, deliberate action. From somewhere in the crowd, a whispered sentiment seemed to float in the air: silence can be armor. Silence can be strength. And sometimes, it is louder than any shout. The words echoed in Marcus's mind, crystallizing the truth of the mission he had undertaken. Courage, he realized, is not always visible. It is patient, it waits, it watches, and when the moment is right, it acts with quiet, unassailable force. The child's small hand finally loosened from the officer's grip, rising slightly as if to wave at the supportive parents and guardians nearby. The moment was cinematic yet understated. The world did not erupt in applause. There were no dramatic gestures, no accolades. Just a quiet recognition that an injustice had been corrected, a life had been protected, and silent courage had triumphed over fear. Marcus turned away before anyone could notice him, blending once again into the city streets. His task was complete. The child was safe, her bruises fading, her spirit protected. The mother, finally willing to confront her own fears, had begun the slow journey toward accountability and care. And in the quiet corners of the world, where eyes often look away, Marcus had restored a measure of justice that would ripple far beyond the walls of that small auditorium. The city moved on, oblivious to the battles quietly fought in its streets, but Marcus Kane knew that true victories often went unseen. In every alley, every home, every moment where fear threatened to silence courage, there existed a choice to look away or to act. Today, one small hand, once bruised and trembling, had been lifted, not only in relief, but in the quiet triumph of safety and dignity restored. Marcus walked the familiar streets, blending with the crowd as if he were just another passerby. He did not need recognition. The impact of his presence was not measured in applause, in headlines, or in social media shares. It was measured in the fragile, yet indomitable spark of hope in the little girl's eyes, in the renewed courage of a mother willing to confront her own fears, and in the invisible thread of justice woven quietly but unbreakably into a world too often indifferent. In that stillness, Marcus reflected on what he had learned over years of service, of witnessing the fragile boundaries between life and loss. Silence can protect, but it can also be broken when courage acts. Compassion can be subtle, yet unyielding. And ordinary streets, ordinary people, can become the stage for extraordinary acts of moral courage, even when no one else notices. Wherever you are watching from today, remember this: courage is not always loud, and heroism is not always visible. Sometimes it exists in those who choose to see suffering, to act patiently, and to protect quietly. The world needs those silent guardians, those who observe, those who intervene, those who ensure that fear does not have the final word. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who has quietly made a difference, share your thoughts in the comments. Honor the heroes in your life. Celebrate the small acts of bravery that too often go unnoticed. And subscribe for more stories that illuminate the unseen strength and resilience that exist all around us. Because in a world where silence often rules, it is the unseen courage, the quiet determination, and the steadfast guardianship that change lives, one child, one moment, one act at a time.